Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Please be seated. The mixed oak and hickory forests on top of the Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee are vibrant ecosystems, full of life of all kinds and at all levels. I came to know those forests well in the 6 years that I lived surrounded by them. I would walk out into the woods, and above me towered white and chestnut oaks, and the occasional pignut or mockernut hickory. And below those canopy trees grew smaller ones, red maple, black gum, young oaks waiting to rise into the canopy when a gap of light might appear. Lower still were the sassafras, the mountain laurels, the greenbrier, the saplings that might one day come up to replace their parents. And lower still was the understory, full of blueberry bushes and a variety of wildflowers, and the occasional clump of wild native grasses. Dozens of species called those forests home. And that's just the beginning of the life present. The summer hum of cicadas, the rat-a-tat of a red-breasted or pileated woodpecker on a decaying tree. Getting stopped in my tracks at the sudden sight of a timber rattler or one of its more harmless relatives. And just beneath the leaf litter, there was a whole other world. A world of fungi and insects, worms, and the small mammals that ate them. They coursed their way through that understory, through what lies underneath, protecting them from the hot Tennessee sun. Those forests were full of life at every level. There's one place where I used to walk, where those forests came to an end and gave way to an entirely different ecosystem. Crossing out from under the oak canopy, the first thing I noticed was the spacing of the trees. In the forest I was leaving behind, everything seemed random, almost chaotic. Trunks, stems, and clumps placed at random distances in random places. But in that new forest, everything was regular, intentional, planned. All the trunks were the same size, all equidistant from one another. The canopy overhead was a monochrome, the pale green of the eastern white pine, stretching on for acres. Where the forest I had left was full of light, these pines crowded each other, letting no light through to the forest floor. And as a result, that forest floor was just a carpet of discarded needles that couldn't support much of anything. By contrast to the woods that I left, it was quiet there. Nothing seemed to stir. And it was at once enchanting and deeply unsettling. I was struck by the contrast, these different worlds that stood side by side, butting up against one another. And I would later learn that this forest was not really a forest at all. It was a pine plantation, planted in the 1960s after the native hardwoods were logged and sold for lumber. And best forestry practices at the time saw the quick and straight growing white pine, though not native to this forest, as the tree of the future, a 20-year turnaround. That's what it promised. 20 years and you could log the same plot again, and 20 more years you could log it again. But what they didn't take into account was the effect that a solid stand of pines would have on the ecosystem. See, a healthy forest relies on that diversity of different trees, different species at different levels, all interacting with one another, all creating a rich array of habitat. All of those various fungi and animals and plants and every living thing help keep one another in check. They maintain a balanced system They cycle nutrients. They allow for change over time. Change that allows the ecosystem to continue on in perpetuity. But by contrast, that pine plantation had no balance. The pines shade out anything beneath them that would help cycle nutrients. Those discarded needles make the soil more acidic, prevent anything from living within it. They take up more nutrients than they're able to put back. And with so many trees of the same species so close together, they're more susceptible to disease, less resilient, less dynamic. It's a community out of balance, with no diversity to maintain its health and function. In the selection that we read today from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, we hear a lot about the necessity of community, the necessity of diversity for forming a healthy and well-functioning community. Paul compares the community of believers to a church, to a body. Just as the body is one and has many members, he writes, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body. So it is with Christ. He articulates a vision of the church that functions because of the many gifts that are present within it, the many different people that make up that body. There are preachers and teachers and apostles, folks who have plenty of money and those who have very little. There are Gentiles who came to follow Jesus and Jews. There's no one way to be a follower of Christ. In fact, the church relies on there being different ways that the same Spirit manifests itself. God's Spirit is revealed differently through each individual person. And so, in a community made up of those diverse individuals, there will be more of God's Spirit present. More of God can be revealed. One of the most radical parts of Paul's metaphor of the body is the way that he talks about the different parts of the body. He's writing in this sort of ancient Greek atmosphere that has a love for categories and a love for hierarchy. That loves to rank things by their worth and relative value. That love for categorization led to a deeply stratified society where you had free people, landholders, slaves, those who were religious minorities. All of them existed in different levels of the hierarchy of the time. And this love for categorization also shaped their understanding of the body. Certain parts and organs were seen as more valuable than others. The sense of sight more important than that of taste or touch. The heart more important than a kidney. The right hand more important than the left. But in our reading today, Paul challenges that understanding of the body. He does away with those rankings and sees every part of the body as being indispensable to the whole. In the same way, the church is equally made up of all its members. And the proper functioning of the church requires the equal participation of all people. Much like that healthy forest ecosystem requires diversity at every level, the church needs all of its members, all of the gifts that are present within it, all the people who cross through its door. Like that pine plantation, the church cannot thrive in monoculture. For Paul, this isn't some human ideal of inclusion and diversity. Rather, it's something inherent to how God made the world and what it means to be a follower of Christ. As one of my clergy colleagues puts it, in the life of faith, community isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. God created us to live together. Jesus calls his disciples from their homes, their towns, their familiar lives to come together and follow him. And in the same way, we have come to St. George's, we have come to this place here today from different locations at different times with a vast range of different life experiences. We've been brought here together not because we agree on everything or that we're necessarily going to see eye to eye, but because we have things to learn from each other. Because the health of our community and the health of one another rely on each of us to share our gifts, to exercise our ministries to one another and to the world beyond the walls of this sanctuary. Today is the day of our annual meeting. And while the idea of an hour-long church meeting may not be your vision of a good time on a Sunday morning, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to see Paul's metaphor of the body at work. It's a chance to be reminded of the many ministries of this place, the many various gifts that are present here in this room. We gather together to honor that God has brought us here into community to serve God's mission in the world. And our job as the body of Christ is not to create the body that Paul talks about or to seek some human ideal of harmonious community. Rather, our job is to reflect who God created us to be, to live out the call to community that all of us received in our baptism and that we come into contact with every Sunday when we receive the Eucharist. We meet together as a single body with many parts, a body in which every member is valued, in which every voice will be heard, in which every single one of us is essential. And it's for that reason that our annual meetings might feel a little different this year. The vestry has set aside nearly half of our time as a time for conversation, as a time that isn't just about us presenting to you, but about hearing from all of you. For all of us engaging in a conversation about what this place means to us, about what the ministries of St. George's have done for you, and how we could spread those ministries out into the world. How we could both bring more people in, but also let God's love shine through us out into our communities. Every time we gather, it's an opportunity for us to wonder together, to discern how we can better function as the body of Christ, and how our particular gifts can build one another up. It's a chance for us to see ourselves as the rich and diverse ecosystem that God has created us to be. And in that ecosystem, each of us has a role to play and a niche to fill. The health of our church and the wider community depend on it. Because community isn't a luxury, but a necessity. And so the question I want to leave us with is this: how do we come together with our different gifts to live as the community that God created us to be? What does it mean for St. George's to be the body of Christ? And how can we better value the contributions of all of our parts? How can we better create opportunities for all of us to exercise our ministry that was given to us in baptism, that God calls us to enact in community? I realize these aren't questions with easy answers, but hope that today, that are throughout our meeting, throughout the years to come, they can be questions that we sit with, that we wonder about, that we talk about together, that we find answers to in relationship with one another, knowing that none of us can do this alone, that at the end of the day, we need each other. We depend on each other. This church depends on every single one of us.